Some wounds never heal, they just get buried deeper with time. Lark Mendenhall carried hers for 30 years, believing her father was a man too broken to love his own daughter. When he died, she didn't cry. She'd already mourned him long ago. Then a lawyer called with news that made no sense. Her father left her an island on a remote glacier lake. She'd never even known it existed. The only way to reach it is by canoe, and the only building is an old lodge rotting into the forest floor. Inside, Lark finds photographs, journals, and a map carved into wooden beams. Each discovery reveals a different man than the one she knew. What was he hiding all those years? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Lark Mendenhall's cabin sat at 7,200 feet, tucked into a fold of granite and pine, where the Montana wilderness pressed close enough to feel like an embrace. She'd built most of it herself over the course of 3 summers in her late 20s, back when her hands were smoother and her back didn't protest every morning. Now at 58, the cabin felt less like an accomplishment and more like an extension of her own body. Weathered, functional, and content to be left alone, the morning the lawyer called, she was splitting wood. The maul came down in a clean arc, and the round of pines separated with a satisfying crack. She stacked the pieces on the growing pile beside the shed, wiping sweat from her forehead despite the cool October air. The garden beds were mulched for winter. The root cellar was stocked with enough preserves, dried beans, and salted venison to last until spring. Her water tank was full from the September rains, and the solar panels she'd installed 5 years ago kept her batteries charged through the shortening days. She didn't need much. That was the point. The phone, an old flip model she kept charged for emergencies, sat on the kitchen windowsill where she'd left it 3 weeks ago. It rang so rarely that the sound startled her, a shrill chirp that seemed out of place among the quiet creak of pines and the distant call of a clerk's nutcracker. She set down the maul and walked inside, her boots leaving prints of sawdust on the plank floor. "Yes? Is this Lark Mendenhall?" The voice was crisp, professional, the kind that suggested paperwork and offices with fluorescent lights. "It is. Ms. Mendenhall. My name is David Ortega. I'm an attorney with Blackstone and Associates in Kalispell. I'm calling regarding the estate of Robert James Mendenhall. I understand he was your father." Lark said nothing for a moment. Through the window, she could see the valley dropping away below her cabin, the ridgeline of the Absarokas rising in the distance like the spine of some ancient sleeping creature. "He was," she said finally. "I'm very sorry for your loss, Mr. Mendenhall. Passed away 2 weeks ago at the VA hospital in Missoula. We've been trying to reach you." She felt nothing. No grief, no shock, not even the faint echo of old anger. Her father had been a ghost long before he died. She'd last seen him when she was 26, at her mother's funeral. He'd stood on the opposite side of the grave, silent and stiff in his dress uniform, and when the service ended, he'd walked away without a word. "She hadn't tried to stop him, I see," Lark said. "Was there something you needed from me?" "Actually, yes. Your father left a will. You're named as the primary beneficiary. There are some assets that require your attention." Lark almost laughed. Assets? Her father had lived in a cramped apartment in Missoula, worked as a part-time security guard after he retired from the military, and drove a truck that was older than most college students. What assets could he possibly have? What kind of assets? Property, primarily. An island, actually. It's located on Prospect Lake, about 40 miles northwest of Whitefish. Approximately 8 acres with a structure on it, a lodge of some kind. The property's been in your father's name since 1974. According to the terms of the will, it's yours now, but there's a stipulation. You need to visit the property within 30 days of his death, or it reverts to the state. Lark sat down at the kitchen table, her legs suddenly unsteady. An island. Her father had owned an island for 50 years and she'd never known. "Miss Mendenhall? Are you still there?" "I'm here. I can send you the paperwork along with directions to the property. There's a key and some additional documents your father left in a safe deposit box. If you're willing to come to Kalispell, I can give them to you in person." She looked around her cabin. The wood stove, the hand-stitched quilts, the shelves lined with jars of tomatoes and pickles. She hadn't left this mountain in 3 years. The last time had been for supplies. A quick trip down to the little town of Emery, 15 miles away, where she'd bought flour, salt, and batteries. She'd felt suffocated the entire time, as though the low elevation and the presence of other people were pressing against her chest. But an island. A place her father had hidden from her. A piece of his life she'd never seen. "I'll come," she said. The drive to Kalispell took most of the day. She hadn't realized how much she'd forgotten about the world beyond her mountain. The traffic, even light as it was on the rural highways, felt aggressive and fast. The sound of engines and the flash of headlights made her grip the steering wheel of her old Ford pickup tighter than necessary. By the time she reached the outskirts of the city, her jaw ached from clenching. Ortega's office was in a modest brick building near the railroad tracks. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 40, with the kind of polished appearance that made her acutely aware of her worn canvas jacket and dirt-rimmed fingernails. If he noticed, he didn't show it. He spread the documents across his desk: a will, a property deed, a hand-drawn map, and a small brass key on a loop of faded paracord. "The island's accessible only by water," Ortega explained. "There's a public access point on the north shore of the lake. Your father kept a canoe there, apparently, though I can't confirm its condition. The lodge was built in the mid-70s, but it hasn't been maintained in years. The property taxes have been paid automatically from an account your father set up decades ago. To be honest, Miss Mendenhall, I don't know much more than what's in these documents. Your father was... well, he wasn't forthcoming about his personal life." Lark turned the key over in her palm. "It was cool and heavy, the brass tarnished to a dull greenish hue. Did he say why he was leaving this to me?" Ortega hesitated. "He left a note. It's addressed to you." He handed her a sealed envelope, her name written in her father's blocky handwriting. She stared at it for a long moment, then folded it and tucked it into her jacket pocket without opening it. "I'll need directions to the lake," she said. She drove northwest as the afternoon light began to slant through the pines. The road wound through national forest land, past trails she'd hiked as a teenager, back when her mother was still alive, and summers meant camping trips and the smell of wood smoke. Her father had been there too, in those memories, but always at the edges, silent, watchful, present but never quite engaged. Her mother had been the one who taught her to build a fire, to identify animal tracks, to move quietly through the woods. Her mother had been warm and patient, quick to laugh and slow to anger. Lark had inherited her mother's hands, long-fingered and strong, and her mother's love of solitude. But where her mother had been content, Lark carried a restlessness she'd never been able to name. When her mother died, a sudden aneurysm at 49, Lark's world had collapsed. She'd been 16, angry at everything and everyone, and her father had responded with the only thing he seemed capable of: silence. He'd gone to work, come home, and sat in his chair with the television on, saying nothing. She'd screamed at him once, demanding to know why he couldn't talk to her, why he couldn't cry or rage or do anything but sit there like a stone. He'd looked at her with those pale grey eyes and said, "Some things you just carry." She'd left home at 18 and never looked back. The lake appeared through the trees like a shard of fallen sky, vast and cold and impossibly blue. She parked at the access point, a gravel lot with a weathered boat ramp and a single picnic table, and stepped out into the wind. The air smelled of water and pine resin. In the distance, she could see the island, a dark hump of forested land rising from the center of the lake. An old man sat on the tailgate of a pickup truck near the ramp, whittling a piece of cedar. He looked up as she approached, his face deeply lined and brown from the sun. "You Lark?" he asked. She stopped. "I am, thought so. Ortega called, said you might be coming. Name's Thomas. I keep an eye on things around here." He nodded toward the lake. "Your father and I had an understanding. I made sure nobody messed with his canoe or tried to get onto his island. In return, he let me fish his side of the lake. Did you know him well?" Thomas shrugged. "Well enough. He was a private man, but decent. Came out here more in the early days, less so toward the end. Last time I saw him was maybe 5-6 years ago. He set down his whittling and looked at her directly. He loved that island. Maybe too much. People don't hide in a place like that unless they're running from something or protecting it. Lark felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. "Where's the canoe?" Thomas pointed toward a thicket of willow and alder at the water's edge. "Down there. I checked it last week. It'll hold." She found the canoe half hidden under a tangle of branches, its hull streaked with moss and bird droppings. But when she dragged it into the light, she saw that it was solid, hand-carved from a single cedar log, the wood still sound beneath the weathering. On the bow, barely visible under the grime, were 2 initials carved into the wood: Sir M. Robert Mendenhall. Her father's hands had shaped this. He'd paddled this water, crossed to that island, lived some part of his life she'd never known. She loaded her pack into the canoe, a sleeping bag, a tarp, enough food for a few days, and pushed off from shore. The paddle felt awkward at first, her rhythm clumsy, but muscle memory returned. She'd learned to paddle as a child, on different lakes in a different life. The water was glass smooth and bitterly cold. She could see down into it, 15 or 20 feet, to the pale stones of the lake bed and the dark shapes of submerged logs. The only sounds were the dip of her paddle and the cry of an osprey circling overhead. It took her 30 minutes to reach the island. As she drew closer, the details resolved. The shore was rocky and steep, the trees pressing close to the water's edge. There was a small dock, listing badly to one side, its planks grey and splintered. She tied the canoe and climbed onto the dock carefully, testing each step. A trail led up from the shore, overgrown but still visible, marked by the occasional cairn of stacked stones. She followed it through the trees, lodgepole pine, Douglas fir, and the occasional aspen turning gold in the autumn light. The silence was profound, broken only by the rustle of wind and the distant lap of water against stone. Then she saw it. The lodge was larger than she'd expected. 2 stories with a steep-pitched roof and a wide-covered porch. It had been built from logs, the kind of solid, rough-hewn construction that belonged to an earlier era. But time and weather had done their work. The roof sagged in places, the porch railing was missing entire sections, and the windows were either broken or filmed with decades of grime. She climbed the porch steps slowly, the boards creaking under her weight. The brass key fit the lock, but the door was swollen in its frame. She had to put her shoulder into it before it gave way with a groan. The smell hit her first: dust and decay, animal droppings, and the faint mineral scent of standing water. The main room was large, dominated by a stone fireplace that rose to the ceiling. There was an old couch, its fabric rotted through, and a table with 2 chairs, one toppled onto its side. Dead leaves had blown in through the broken windows, piling in the corners, but above the fireplace, something caught her eye. A row of frames, still hanging on the wall. She crossed the room and wiped the dust from the glass. Photographs, her father, young and lean in his army uniform, smiling at the camera. Another of him standing beside a woman Lark had never seen, dark-haired and beautiful, laughing at something beyond the frame. A third photo showed the same woman holding a small child, maybe 3 or 4 years old, bundled in a winter coat. Lark stared at them, her breath shallow. Not her mother, not her. Her father had another family, and this island was where they'd lived. Lark stood before the photographs for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The light coming through the broken windows shifted, throwing shadows across her father's young face, across the woman's smile, across the child's wide eyes. She tried to find malice in the images, some evidence of deception or cruelty, but all she saw was happiness, a kind of unguarded joy she'd never witnessed in her father. She stepped back and surveyed the rest of the room with new eyes. This wasn't a hunting cabin or a bachelor's retreat. It was a home. There were curtains, faded now and hanging in tatters, but once cheerful, patterned with wildflowers. A rug in front of the fireplace, worn but carefully placed. Shelves lined one wall, most of the books swollen with moisture and unreadable. but a few titles still visible. Field Guides to Northwestern Birds and Wildflowers, a collection of Jack London stories, a child's picture book about a bear cub. The betrayal settled into her chest like a stone. She moved through the lodge methodically, opening doors and taking inventory of the wreckage. The kitchen was barely functional. A cast-iron stove rusted beyond use, cabinets hanging open to reveal cans, so old the labels had faded to ghosts of color. A calendar hung on the wall above the sink, its pages yellowed and brittle. July 1987, 37 years frozen in place. Beyond the kitchen, a narrow hallway led to 2 bedrooms. The first was small, clearly meant for a child. A twin bed frame held the collapsed remains of a mattress, springs poking through the fabric. There was a shelf with toys, a wooden truck, a stuffed rabbit with one ear missing, a tin of crayons spilled across the floor, their colors melted into a waxy rainbow. On the wall above the bed, someone had pinned drawings, the paper curled and spotted with mildew. Lark approached slowly, as though the drawings might disintegrate under her gaze. The first showed stick figures holding hands. A man, a woman, a small girl with a triangle dress, and a smile made from a single curved line. The second depicted a mountain and a lake, the water rendered in careful blue strokes. The third showed a tree, its branches full of what might have been birds or leaves, and beneath it the same 3 figures, this time sitting together. In the bottom corner of each drawing, in a child's careful letters, "Love, Rosie." Rosie. Her father had a daughter named Rosie. Lark's hands trembled as she lifted the drawing from the wall. The paper came away easily, the pins long since rusted. She held it to the light from the window and studied the faces. There was no detail, no way to read emotion into those stick-figure features. But the arrangement of the figures, close together, hands joined, spoke of something Lark had never experienced with her father: connection, belonging. She set the drawing down carefully and moved to the second bedroom. This one was larger, with a double bed and a dresser listing against the far wall. Men's clothing still hung in the open closet, flannel shirts, canvas work pants, a leather belt draped over a hook. She recognized the style. Her father had dressed this way for as long as she could remember, practical, durable, nothing wasted. She opened the dresser drawers one by one. Socks, undershirts, a few wool sweaters. In the bottom drawer, beneath a pile of faded thermal underwear, her fingers found something solid. She pulled it out, a tackle box, green metal with a corroded latch. Inside, fishing lures gleamed dully, spinners and spoons, hand-tied flies, lead weights in a small compartment. Someone had cared for these. They were organized, clean, ready for use. She imagined her father here, sitting on the porch in the early morning, tying a fly to a line, teaching a child to cast. The image was so vivid and so impossible that it hurt. She closed the tackle box and sat on the edge of the bed. The frame groaned under her weight. Through the window, she could see the lake stretching toward the distant mountains, the water burnished gold in the afternoon light. It was beautiful here. Peaceful, the kind of place someone might come to escape the world or to build a different one. But why hadn't he told her? Why had he let her believe he was alone, that she was alone, when all this existed? She stood and walked back to the main room, drawn again to the photographs. She took the one of her father and the woman off the wall and turned it over. On the back, in her father's handwriting, V and me, June 1973 V. The woman's name began with V. Lark, folded the photograph carefully and slipped it into her jacket pocket, then turned her attention to the rest of the lodge. There had to be more. People didn't just vanish from a place like this. They left traces, explanations, something. As the light began to fade, she cleared a space near the fireplace and unrolled her sleeping bag. She'd brought matches and kindling, and the chimney, despite its age, still drew well. Soon she had a small fire crackling, the warmth pushing back the chill that seemed to seep from the very walls. She heated water for tea and ate a simple meal of dried venison and crackers, her mind circling the same questions over and over. Who was V? Who was Rosie? And why had her father kept them secret? She thought about the timeline. The photograph was dated 1973. She'd been born in 1967, which meant her father had been married to her mother for at least 6 years when that photo was taken. The calendar in the kitchen was from 1987. She'd been 20 years old then, already out of the house, already building her cabin in the mountains. Her mother had still been alive, had her mother known. The thought was unbearable. She pushed it away and focused instead on the fire, feeding it small pieces of wood, watching the flames twist and curl. As the room warmed, she noticed something she'd missed earlier. On the floor near the couch, half buried under a drift of leaves and debris, was a newspaper. She pulled it free and brushed off the dirt. The paper was brittle, the ink faded, but the date was still visible, August 15th, 1987. She unfolded it carefully, expecting to find nothing more than old headlines and weather reports. But in the margins, someone had written notes in pencil, the handwriting small and cramped. Her father's handwriting, "Rosie won't talk to me." 3 days now. I don't know how to fix this. Have to keep her safe. They can never know. V would know what to do. God, I miss her. Lark's breath caught. The notes were fragmented, desperate, written by someone in pain. She turned the newspaper over, searching for more, but found only one additional line, written across the bottom of the front page. This place was supposed to be for us. Now it's just a reminder of what I ruined. She set the newspaper down and stared into the fire. Her father's voice, preserved in the margins of a decades-old paper, spoke of guilt and loss and someone he was trying to protect. Rosie, the child in the drawings. In the photographs, her sister. The word settled into her mind with a strange inevitability. She had a sister, a half-sister at least, someone who had lived here, who had known their father in a way Lark never had, someone he'd written about with a tenderness she'd never heard in his voice. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the broken windows and sending eddies of cold air through the room. The fire flickered and shadows danced across the walls. Lark pulled her sleeping bag closer and lay down, staring at the ceiling. She didn't sleep. Instead, she listened to the island, the creak of trees, the distant call of an owl, the whisper of water against stone. And she thought about her father, trying to reconcile the man she'd known with the man who had built this place, who had loved someone named V, who had cared for a daughter named Rosie. Who was he? And what had he been running from? By morning, she knew she couldn't leave until she found the answers. Dawn came slowly to the island, the light filtering through the pines in soft grey bands. Lark woke stiff and cold, the fire reduced to ash and embers. She rebuilt it methodically, coaxing flames from the coals, then heated water for coffee. The ritual was familiar, grounding. It gave her hands something to do, while her mind worked through the puzzle her father had left behind. She spent the morning searching the lodge systematically, moving from room to room with the patience she'd learned from years of living alone. In the child's bedroom, she examined everything more carefully than she had the night before. The toys on the shelf, the crayons on the floor, the drawings on the wall. She unpinned each one and laid them out on the bed frame in chronological order, judging by the increasing sophistication of the artwork. The earliest drawings were simple, shapes and colors with no clear subject. Then came the stick figures, always 3 of them, always together. Later drawings showed more detail. A house that looked like the lodge, a canoe on water, a deer standing among trees. In one, a girl with long, dark hair stood beside a man holding a fishing rod. They were both smiling. In every drawing in the corner, the same signature, Love, Rosie. Lark traced the letters with her fingertip. Rosie had been here. She'd slept in this bed, drawn these pictures, played with these toys. And then she'd left, or been taken, and the lodge had been abandoned to rot. She moved to the dresser and opened each drawer again, this time searching more thoroughly. In the back of the top drawer, behind a stack of small T-shirts and faded jeans, she found a photograph. It showed a girl of maybe 10 or 11 standing on the dock outside. She wore overalls and a green jacket, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. She wasn't smiling, but she didn't look unhappy either, just present, watching the camera with a directness that reminded Lark of herself at that age. On the back, Rosie, summer 1984. Lark did the math. If Rosie was 10 in 1984, she'd been born around 1974. She'd be 50 now, a grown woman with a life somewhere beyond this island. If she was still alive, the thought sent a chill through her. She had a sister who might not even know she existed. A sister their father had hidden away, along with this entire piece of his life. She pocketed the photograph and moved to the kitchen, where the ancient canned goods sat in quiet judgment on the shelves. Most were rusted beyond recognition, but a few remained intact. Tomatoes, green beans, peaches in heavy syrup. She checked the dates. 1985, 1986, 1987. Someone had stocked this kitchen and then walked away, leaving everything behind. The calendar on the wall drew her attention again. July 1987. She lifted it carefully from its nail and examined the pages. Several dates had been marked with a pencil, small X's on the 3rd, the 10th, the 17th. A pattern, maybe. Visits or departures. The last mark was on July 24th, circled heavily, with a single word written beside it. Gone, gone. Who was gone? Rosie, her father. Someone else? She hung the calendar back on its nail and opened the cabinets beneath the sink. More rust, more decay, and, tucked in the far back corner, a small wooden box. She pulled it free and brushed away the cobwebs. The box was plain, unvarnished pine, with a simple brass clasp. She opened it. Inside were envelopes, dozens of them bound together with a rubber band that disintegrated at her touch. The envelopes were addressed in her father's handwriting, but the ink had faded and many were water-stained. She spread them across the kitchen counter and began to read the addresses. All of them were addressed to Rosie. No last name, just Rosie, but each had a different address. Seattle, Portland, Spokane, Boise, cities scattered across the Northwest. The postmarks ranged from 1988 to 2003. 15 years of letters sent to a daughter who must have moved again and again, always leaving a forwarding address, always staying just out of reach, or maybe not out of reach. Maybe she simply hadn't wanted to be reached. Lark picked up the envelope with the most recent postmark, April 2003, sent to an address in Tacoma, Washington. The envelope had been opened. She pulled out the letter inside, unfolded it, and read, "Dear Rosie, I don't know if you'll read this, but I'm writing it anyway. It's been 16 years since you left the island. I understand why you went. I understand why you won't see me. But I need you to know that I'm sorry. I'm sorry for the choices I made, for the things I couldn't give you, for being the kind of man who thought hiding was the same as protecting. Your mother deserved better. You deserved better. I still visit the island sometimes, though it's hard now. My knees aren't what they used to be, and the paddle across feels longer every year. I keep thinking I'll fix the place up, make it like it was when you were small. But every time I go, I just sit on the porch and remember. I hope you're happy, Rosie. I hope you've built a life that feels whole. I hope you've forgiven me, even if you can't tell me so. Love, Dad." Lark read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and returned it to its envelope. Her father's voice in the letter was nothing like the man she'd known, soft where he'd been hard, vulnerable where he'd been distant. It was as though he'd been two different people, and she'd only ever known one of them. She sorted through the other letters, but most of them were still sealed. Her father had sent them, but Rosie had never opened them. The weight of that, years of unanswered attempts at connection, pressed against Lark's chest. She understood rejection. She'd rejected her father too, in her own way, by choosing the mountain and the isolation and the silence. But at least she'd had a choice. At least he'd still been alive somewhere, even if she didn't speak to him. Rosie had grown up in a half-life, hidden on an island, loved by a man who couldn't acknowledge her publicly. And then she'd left, and he'd spent the rest of his life reaching for her through letters she wouldn't read. Lark gathered the envelopes and placed them back in the wooden box, then carried it to the main room and set it beside the fireplace. She needed to think. She needed to understand the full shape of this before she could decide what to do. She left the lodge and walked down to the dock, where the canoe bobbed gently in the water. The lake was calm, the surface reflecting the sky in perfect symmetry. She sat on the edge of the dock, her legs dangling over the water, and let the silence settle around her. Her father had loved two families. Or maybe he'd loved one family and endured another. She didn't know which was true, and the not knowing felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, unable to see the bottom. She thought about her mother, kind, patient, always present. Had she known about Rosie? About the island? Or had she been as much in the dark as Lark herself? The questions circled, unanswerable, until the sun began to drop toward the horizon. She stood and returned to the lodge, determined to keep searching. Somewhere in this decaying building was the full truth, and she was going to find it. The next morning, Lark paddled back to shore with a new purpose. The island had given her pieces of the story, but not enough. She needed context, records, something that could connect her father's hidden life to the world beyond the water. She drove to the nearest town, a small place called Whitefish, 20 miles from the lake, and found the public library tucked between a hardware store and a cafe. The library was quiet, staffed by a single older woman with steel-grey hair and reading glasses on a beaded chain. She looked up from her computer as Lark approached the front desk. "Can I help you find something?" "I'm looking for property records," Lark said, "specifically for an island on Prospect Lake. It would have been purchased in 1974. The woman's expression shifted, something between curiosity and caution. "Prospect Lake? That's a ways out. Not many properties out there." She stood and gestured for Lark to follow her to a computer terminal in the corner. "We have county records digitized back to 1970. You can search by location or owner name." Lark sat down and typed in her father's name, Robert James Mendenhall. The search returned a single result. A property purchase dated March 15, 1974, for 8 acres on Prospect Lake, listed as undeveloped land. The purchase price was listed as $12,000 paid in full. The year before, her father married her mother. He'd bought the island before he'd committed to the life Lark knew. She printed the record and studied it. There was nothing unusual about the transaction. No indication of why he'd chosen this particular piece of land or what he'd planned to do with it. Just a straightforward purchase, documented and forgotten. "Did you find what you needed?" The librarian had appeared beside her, quiet as a cat. "Mostly," Lark said. She hesitated, then added, "Do you know anything about the island? About who might have lived there?" The woman's eyes narrowed slightly. "I've lived here 43 years. I know most of the families in the area, at least by name. But Prospect Lake, that's always been private. Folks out there keep to themselves." She paused, as though weighing whether to continue. "You related to the Mendenhalls?" "He was my father." "Robert Mendenhall." The woman nodded slowly. "I remember him. Quiet man. Didn't come into town much, but when he did, he was polite. Kept his business to himself." She glanced at the printed record in Lark's hand. "That island, I always wondered about it. He'd come through town every few weeks, buy supplies, then head back out. This was years ago, mind you. 80s, early 90s. Then he stopped coming. I figured he'd sold the place or passed on. He passed 2 weeks ago." "I'm sorry to hear that." The woman's expression softened. "He leave you the island?" "He did." The librarian nodded, as though that confirmed something she'd been wondering. "Well, if you need anything else, you let me know." She turned to leave, then stopped. "There was a woman, you know. She used to come into town with him sometimes. Dark hair, pretty. They'd have a child with them, a little girl. This was back in the late 70s, early 80s. Then one day, it was just him. I never saw the woman or the girl again." Lark's heart beat faster. "Do you remember the woman's name?" "No, I'm sorry, it was a long time ago, but she was kind. I remember that. Always said hello, always smiled." The librarian paused. "I hope whatever you're looking for out there, you find it." Lark thanked her and left the library, her mind racing. The woman, V, had been real, visible, part of her father's life in a way that left traces. She'd come to town with him. She'd existed in the world, not just in photographs and faded letters. And then she disappeared. Lark drove back to the lake, her hands tight on the wheel. The pieces were beginning to assemble, but the picture they formed was still incomplete. She needed more. She needed to understand what had happened to V, to Rosie, to the life her father had built and then abandoned. Back on the island, she turned her attention to the one place she hadn't fully explored, the attic. The lodge had a pull-down ladder in the hallway ceiling, the kind that folded up out of sight. She tugged it down, the hinges protesting, and climbed into the dim space above. The attic was low-ceilinged and stifling, the air thick with dust and the smell of old wood. Light filtered through cracks in the roof, illuminating floating moats and casting everything in shades of grey. Boxes lined the walls, their cardboard warped and splitting. Lark opened the first one carefully. Blankets, quilts, hand-stitched and moth-eaten, their patterns still faintly visible. Beneath them, a stack of photo albums, the covers stiff with age. She pulled one out and opened it. More photographs. Her father, younger than she'd ever seen him, standing beside a woman who had to be V. They were at a carnival or fair, cotton candy, and bright lights in the background. Another photo showed them sitting on a beach, the ocean stretching behind them. V was laughing, her head thrown back, her hand on her father's arm. Lark turned the pages slowly. There were pictures of Rosie as a baby, then as a toddler, then as a young child. Always with one or both parents, always on the island or near the lake. Never anywhere that suggested a life beyond this hidden place. The last page of the album held a single photograph, different from the others. It was a formal portrait, the kind taken in a studio. V sat in a chair, her hands folded in her lap, her expression serene. She wore a simple dress and a strand of pearls. At the bottom of the photo, in careful script, Violet Reyes, 1973. Violet. Her name was Violet. Lark closed the album and opened the next box. Inside were papers, medical records, bills, receipts. She sorted through them, looking for anything that might explain what had happened. A hospital bill from 1982, charges for a long-term stay, another from 1984, then a death certificate dated August 3rd, 1985. Violet Ann Reyes, cause of death, complications from ovarian cancer. She'd been 39 years old. Lark sat back on her heels, the certificate in her hands. Violet had died here, or near here, after years of illness, and her father had been with her, or tried to be, while maintaining his other life with Lark and her mother. The weight of that deception, the sheer effort it must have taken to keep two families separate, was staggering. And yet he'd done it for years, until Violet's death made it impossible to continue. But that didn't explain what happened to Rosie. The calendar in the kitchen said July 1987, 2 years after Violet died. Rosie had been here, living with her father, and then she'd left. The letters suggested she'd cut contact, refused to see him. Why? Lark dug deeper into the boxes, searching for an answer. She found school records, homeschool documentation signed by her father. Rosie's grades, her progress reports, all of it kept meticulously. Then, in the bottom of the last box, she found a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and faded. She opened it to the first page. Her father's handwriting dated January 1st, 1975. This is a record of the life I'm building with Violet and our daughter. I know I should tell Lark, tell her mother, but I can't. I'm not strong enough. This is my failure, and I'll carry it alone. Lark turned the pages, reading by the dim light from the cracks in the roof. The journal spanned years, entries about Rosie's first steps, her first words, the garden Violet planted, the fish they caught, the quiet contentment of their days. And woven through it all, her father's guilt. I love them both. How can I choose? How can I walk away from either life without destroying everything? She read until the light faded and her eyes ached. The journal ended in 1980, 5 years before Violet's death. Whatever happened after that, her father hadn't written it down, or he'd written it somewhere else. Lark climbed down from the attic, the journal tucked under her arm, and sat by the fire as darkness settled over the island. She had more answers now, but they only led to deeper questions. Her father had loved Violet. He'd built a life with her, but he'd also kept that life hidden, maintained his marriage to Lark's mother, and lived in a state of perpetual division. And Rosie, abandoned after her mother died, rejected by the father, who couldn't fully commit, had walked away and never looked back. Lark stared into the flames and felt for the first time a flicker of understanding. Her father's silence hadn't been coldness, it had been shame. Lark spent the next 2 days reading the journal by firelight, tracing the arc of her father's secret life. The entries were sporadic, sometimes separated by months, sometimes written daily. They painted a picture of a man caught between two worlds, unable to commit fully to either. In 1975, he wrote about Rosie's first birthday party, just the three of them on the island. A cake Violet had baked in the cast-iron stove. In 1976, he described teaching Rosie to recognize animal tracks in the snow. In 1977, he built a swing near the dock, and Rosie spent hours on it, singing to herself while Violet gardened nearby. But woven through these moments of simple joy were darker threads. Entries about lying to Lark's mother, about making excuses for his absences, about the growing weight of deception. He wrote about the promotions he turned down because they would have required relocating, about the questions his colleagues asked that he couldn't answer honestly. "I'm a coward," he wrote in September 1978. "I tell myself I'm protecting everyone, but I'm only protecting myself. If I were brave, I'd tell the truth. But the truth would destroy everything, and I don't have the strength to rebuild from that wreckage." By 1980, when the journal ended, Violet was already sick. The entries became shorter, more fragmented. He wrote about doctor's appointments, experimental treatments, the slow erosion of hope. The last entry was dated December 23, 1980. "Have told me today she doesn't blame me. She said she knew what she was choosing when she agreed to stay here, to keep this life hidden. She said she'd rather have part of me than none of me. I don't deserve her forgiveness, but I'll take it. I don't know what else to do." Lark closed the journal and set it aside. The fire had burned low, and the lodge was cold again. She wrapped herself in her sleeping bag and stared at the ceiling, trying to imagine her father's life during those years, splitting his time between the island and the home he shared with Lark and her mother, maintaining two separate identities, two separate versions of himself. And her mother, had she known, or suspected? Lark thought back to her childhood, searching for signs of tension or betrayal. But all she remembered was her mother's steady kindness, her quiet competence. If there had been cracks in the marriage, Lark had been too young to see them. The next morning, she returned to the attic, determined to find more. The boxes she'd already searched had given her the beginning of the story, but not the end. She needed to know what happened after Violet died, why Rosie had left, and how the lodge had come to sit empty for nearly 40 years. She found the answers in a box tucked beneath the eaves. So far back, she'd missed it on her first search. Inside were more journals, these ones dated from 1981 to 1987. She carried them down to the main room and began to read. The entries after Violet's death were raw, unguarded in a way the earlier ones hadn't been. Her father wrote about his grief, about the impossibility of mourning openly when no one in his other life knew what he'd lost. He described Rosie's withdrawal, the way she'd stopped speaking to him for days at a time, how she'd look at him with eyes that asked questions he couldn't answer. In 1986, he wrote about bringing Rosie to the island alone, trying to maintain some connection to the life they'd had. But the island without Violet was different, haunted, empty. Rosie spent most of her time in her room or walking the trails by herself. She was 15, old enough to understand the full scope of her father's deception, old enough to feel its consequences. "She asked me today why I never told anyone about her," he wrote in June 1986. "Why she couldn't go to regular school, why she couldn't have friends, why we had to hide. I tried to explain, but everything I said sounded hollow. The truth is, I was afraid." Afraid of losing my career, afraid of the judgment, afraid of hurting Lark and her mother. But mostly I was afraid of being seen for what I am, a man who chose his comfort over his courage. In July 1987, the tone shifted. Rosie had turned 17, and she'd started asking about leaving. She wanted to finish high school in a real school, go to college, live a life that wasn't defined by her father's shame. He tried to convince her to stay, but his arguments fell apart under her scrutiny. The entry dated July 24th, 1987, was the longest and the last. Rosie left today. I drove her to the bus station in Kalispell. She had one suitcase and a backpack, everything she owned. She wouldn't look at me when we said goodbye. She just got on the bus and found a seat by the window, her face turned away. I stood there until the bus pulled out, but she never looked back. I know she's right to go. I know I failed her in every way that matters. Her mother would be ashamed of me, and she should be. Lark would be ashamed of me, too, if she knew. I'm going to close up the lodge. I can't come here anymore. Every room, every corner is a reminder of what I had and what I threw away. Rosie deserves better than this place, better than me. I hope she builds a life that's full and honest, the kind of life I never gave her. I'll keep sending letters. Maybe one day she'll read them. Maybe one day she'll forgive me. But I don't expect it, and I don't deserve it. This island was supposed to be a sanctuary. Instead, it became a cage. I'm leaving it behind, just like Rosie did. And maybe that's the only honest thing I've done in years. Lark set the journal down, her hands trembling. Her father had walked away from the island in 1987, the same year she'd left home to build her cabin in the mountains. They'd both been running in their own ways, from the weight of lives they couldn't sustain. But while she'd been building something, solitude, yes, but also peace, he'd been abandoning everything. His life with Violet and Rosie, his marriage to her mother, even his own sense of self. He'd spent the rest of his years trying to reach a daughter who wouldn't answer, haunted by the choices he'd made. Lark walked down to the dock and sat at the edge, her feet inches above the water. The lake stretched out before her, vast and indifferent. She thought about Rosie, 17 and angry, getting on a bus to anywhere. She thought about her father, standing in a parking lot, watching that bus disappear. And she thought about herself, 20 years old and furious, walking away from her mother's funeral without looking back. They were all runners, all of them, shaped by the same man's inability to choose, to commit, to face the consequences of his own life. But Rosie was still out there, somewhere. She'd be 50 now, maybe with a family of her own, maybe still alone. Lark didn't know, but she knew one thing. She couldn't walk away from this. Not like her father had. Not like Rosie had. If there was any chance of understanding, of connection, she had to try. She returned to the lodge and searched through the box of letters again, looking for the most recent address. She found it, 2003, Tacoma, Washington. 21 years old, but it was a start. She packed her things, locked the lodge, and paddled back to shore. By the time the sun set, she was on the road, heading west toward the coast, toward a sister she'd never known, toward answers she wasn't sure she wanted. Seattle sat gray and drizzling under low clouds when Lark crossed the Cascades 2 days later. She'd driven straight through, stopping only for gas and coffee, her mind too restless for sleep. The address from the 2003 letter led her to Tacoma, a city she'd never visited, sprawling along the shores of Puget Sound. She found the street easily enough, a quiet neighborhood of modest homes with tidy lawns and cars parked in driveways. The house that matched the address was a small craftsman bungalow painted pale yellow, with a porch swing and flower boxes beneath the windows. It looked settled, cared for, nothing like the decaying lodge on the island. Lark sat in her truck for 20 minutes, working up the courage to knock. What would she say? How did you introduce yourself to a sister you'd never known existed? Every opening line she imagined sounded inadequate, presumptuous, or cruel. Finally, she forced herself out of the truck and walked to the front door. She knocked before she could change her mind. Footsteps inside, then the door opened. A woman stood there, maybe 50, with dark hair pulled back in a loose bun and eyes that were startlingly familiar. Lark's father's eyes, pale gray and watchful. "Can I help you?" The woman's voice was cautious, polite. Lark's throat tightened. Are you Rosie? The woman's expression shifted, something hardening behind her eyes. I go by Rose now. Have for a long time. Who are you? My name is Lark Mendenhall. Rose's face went still. For a moment she said nothing, just stood there staring. Then quietly, so he finally told you. No, Lark said. He died 2 weeks ago. I found out about you, about the island from his will. Rose's hand tightened on the doorframe. She looked past Lark to the truck, then back to her face, as though trying to decide whether to believe her. Finally she stepped back. You'd better come in. The inside of the house was warm and comfortable, filled with books and plants and soft light from table lamps. A cat watched Lark from the back of a sofa. Rose gestured to a chair at the kitchen table and filled 2 mugs with coffee without asking if Lark wanted any. They sat across from each other, the silence heavy. How did you find me? Rose asked. The letters, the ones you never opened. The address on the last one, this address. Rose's jaw tightened. I haven't lived here in 15 years. I kept a mail forward for a while, just in case. She stopped, shook her head. It doesn't matter. You found me. So now what? Lark pulled the photograph from her jacket pocket, the one of Rose at 10 years old, standing on the dock. She slid it across the table. I went to the island. I found this, and journals and letters and drawings you made when you were small. I wanted to understand. I needed to understand what happened. Rose picked up the photograph, her expression unreadable. What happened is simple. He lied to everyone. For decades. She set the photo down. You want to know the worst part? I didn't even know you existed until I was 15. I thought I was his only daughter. I thought we were a family, just hidden. Then my mother got sick, and he couldn't keep the lies straight anymore. One day he let it slip. He had another family, a wife, another daughter, a whole life that was real, while we were the secret. Lark felt the words like a punch. I didn't know about you either. Not until last week. At least you got to be legitimate, Rose said, her voice hard. You got to exist in the world. I was a ghost. I couldn't go to school, couldn't have friends, couldn't tell anyone my father's name. And after my mother died, it got worse. He tried. I'll give him that. He'd come to the island, stay for a few days, try to be a parent. But then he'd leave again, and I'd be alone. When I turned 17, I decided I was done. I left, changed my name, and built a life he couldn't touch. The letters, Lark began. I never read them, Rose said. I couldn't. Every time one showed up, it felt like he was trying to pull me back into that lie. So I just let them pile up. Eventually I moved and they stopped coming. She met Lark's eyes. I spent years trying to forget him. Forget the island. Forget all of it. And now you're here dragging it all back. Lark set her coffee mug down carefully. I'm not here to drag anything back. I'm here because I didn't understand him either. He was cold, distant. I spent my whole childhood thinking he didn't love me. And now I know why. He was carrying so much guilt, so much shame, that he didn't know how to be present for anyone. That's not an excuse, Rose said. No, Lark agreed. It's not, but it's an explanation. And I thought maybe you'd want to know. Maybe it would help. Rose was quiet for a long moment. Then she stood and left the kitchen, returning with the shoebox. She set it on the table between them. These are the letters. The ones I kept. I never opened them, but I couldn't throw them away either. I don't know why. Sentiment, maybe. Or anger, both. Lark stared at the box. Dozens of letters, years of her father's attempts to reach a daughter who wouldn't reach back. Do you want to read them now? Rose shook her head. I don't know. Maybe. But not today. She pulled one envelope from the top of the pile and held it up. Do you know what the hardest part is? I spent so long hating him that I don't know how to feel anything else. And now he's dead, and I can't even yell at him for what he did. I'm just stuck. Lark understood that. She'd been stuck, too, for 30 years, in the silence her father had built between them. He left me his final letter, she said. In the will. I haven't read it yet. I couldn't until I understood more about who he was. And do you understand him? A little, Lark said. Enough to know he was broken. Enough to know he hurt everyone he tried to love, including himself. Rose looked at her for a long time, then said, "You look like him." "Around the eyes, so do you." Rose almost smiled, almost. "What are you going to do with the island?" "I don't know," Lark admitted. "Part of me wants to burn it down. Part of me thinks maybe it doesn't have to stay a place of secrets. Maybe it could be something else." "Like what?" "I don't know yet." Rose stood and refilled their coffee mugs, then sat down again. "Tell me about yourself. About your life. If we're sisters, I should at least know who you are." And so Lark did. She told Rose about the cabin, about living off the grid, about the 30 years she'd spent in solitude. She told her about their mother, about the funeral, about the long silence that had followed. Rose listened, asking questions, and gradually the tension in the room eased. When Lark finally stood to leave hours later, Rose walked her to the door. "I can't promise anything," Rose said. "I don't know if I can forgive him. I don't even know if I want to." "That's okay," Lark said. "Forgiveness isn't the point. Understanding is." Rose nodded slowly. "If you come back, if you want to talk more, call first. I'm not good with surprises." "I will." As Lark drove away, she glanced in the rearview mirror and saw Rose still standing on the porch, the shoebox of letters in her arms. It wasn't reconciliation. It wasn't healing. But it was a beginning, and that was more than either of them had expected. Lark stayed in Seattle for 3 days, giving Rose space, but remaining close enough to talk if she wanted to. On the 3rd day, Rose called and asked her to come back to the house. When Lark arrived, Rose was sitting at the kitchen table, the shoebox open in front of her, letters spread across the surface like a paper quilt. "I started reading them," Rose said without preamble. "Last night. I couldn't sleep, so I just started." Her eyes were red-rimmed, exhausted. "I got through about 20 of them. Most of it is what you'd expect. Apologies, explanations, updates about his life. Boring stuff, really. But then I got to this one." She held up an envelope, the paper yellowed and creased. "It's dated 3 weeks before he died. And it's different." Lark sat down across from her. "Different how?" Rose opened the envelope and pulled out several pages, handwritten in their father's now familiar script. "He tells the whole story, everything, things I didn't know. Things maybe you didn't know either." She slid the pages across the table. "I think you should read it." Lark picked up the letter and began to read. "Dear Rosie, I'm writing this from the hospital. The doctors tell me I have weeks, maybe a month. Lung cancer spread to my liver and bones. I spent 50 years avoiding the consequences of my choices, and now I'm out of time. I've lied to you your entire life, not just by what I did, but by what I didn't say. So here's the truth, all of it, before I run out of chances to tell it. I met your mother in 1972 during my 2nd deployment. She was working as a translator on base, and I fell in love with her the first time I heard her laugh. We got married 6 months later, a small ceremony, just the 2 of us and a chaplain. I was 28. She was 26. We were happy. When I came back to the States in 1973, she was pregnant with you. But I was also being considered for a promotion, one that would have changed everything. Better pay, better assignments, a clear path to higher rank. The only problem was that the promotion required a clean record, no complications. And a wife I'd married overseas without proper clearances, that was a complication. I panicked. I convinced myself that the marriage wasn't legitimate, that there'd been some kind of paperwork error. I filed for an annulment without your mother's full understanding. I told her it was a formality, something the military required, and that we'd remarry stateside. But I didn't. Instead, I met Lark's mother, a woman my commanding officer introduced me to, and I married her in 1974. A proper American wedding, witnessed and documented, the kind that looked good on my service record. Your mother didn't understand what I'd done until it was too late. By then, you'd been born, and I was living 2 lives. I bought the island as a place for the 3 of us, a sanctuary where I could pretend I wasn't a coward. I told your mother we'd figure it out eventually, that I'd find a way to make it right. But I never did. I kept you hidden because I was afraid. Afraid of losing my career, afraid of the judgment, afraid of admitting that I'd chosen my ambition over the people I loved. Your mother never blamed me, Rosie. She should have, but she didn't. She said she'd rather have part of me than none of me. And I let her believe that was enough. When she got sick, I tried to be there. I spent every spare moment on the island, but it wasn't enough. It was never enough. And when she died, I knew I'd destroyed the only good thing I'd ever been part of. I tried to be a father to you after that, but I didn't know how. I'd spent so many years compartmentalizing my life that I didn't know how to be whole. And you were smart enough to see through me. You knew I was a fraud, and you were right to leave. I never told Lark about you. I couldn't. Every time I looked at her, I saw what I'd stolen from you. She deserved a father who was present, who loved her without conditions. But I couldn't be that person, because I knew I didn't deserve to be. The island was supposed to be a sanctuary, but it became a monument to my cowardice. I'm leaving it to Lark, because she's the only one of my daughters I failed without stealing her entire identity. You, Rosie, you deserved legitimacy, recognition, a father who claimed you publicly. I took that from you and I can't give it back, but maybe Lark can. Maybe she can find you, tell you the truth, and give you the one thing I never could, a sister. You both deserved better than me, but at least you can have each other. I'm sorry, Rosie. I'm sorry for every lie, every absence, every moment I chose my comfort over your dignity. I'm sorry I was too weak to be the father you needed. And I'm sorry I can't fix it now, when it's too late to matter. If you're reading this, it means Lark found you. I hope you'll give her a chance. She's strong and stubborn and kind, everything I wasn't. She doesn't know it yet, but she's been shaped by my failures just like you were. Maybe together you can build something better than the wreckage I left behind. The island is yours if you want it. Both of yours. Do with it what you will. Burn it, sell it, or turn it into something that isn't haunted by my mistakes. Just don't let it sit empty and rotting like I did with my own life. I love you, Rosie. I loved your mother. I loved Lark, but I didn't love any of you enough to be brave. That's my failure, and I'll carry it to the grave, Dad. Lark set the letter down, her hands shaking. The room felt too small, the air too thin. She'd thought she understood, thought she'd pieced together the full story from the journals and the photographs and the fragments she'd found. But this was worse than she'd imagined. Her father hadn't just had an affair. He'd erased a marriage, denied his first daughter's legitimacy, and built his life on a foundation of deliberate erasure. He'd stolen Violet's dignity and Rosie's identity, all to protect a career and a reputation that hadn't even mattered in the end. Rose was watching her, her expression unreadable. I didn't know he annulled the marriage, she said quietly. I knew he was married to your mother, but I thought maybe my mother and I came first, and then he left us for her. But it was the opposite. We were never legitimate. He made sure of that. Lark felt the weight of it pressed down on her. Rose, it's not your fault, Rose said, but her voice was flat, exhausted. You didn't know. Neither of us did. But now we do, and we have to decide what that means. He was a coward, Lark said, the words bitter in her mouth. Yes, Rose agreed. But he knew it, and he carried it every day. That doesn't excuse what he did, but... She stopped, her voice breaking. I wanted to hate him. I've spent 30 years hating him. But now I just feel tired. Lark reached across the table and took Rose's hand. Rose didn't pull away. They sat like that for a long time. Two women bound by the same absence, the same betrayal, the same man who'd failed them both. Finally, Rose spoke. The letter says the island is ours. Both of ours. What do you want to do with it? Lark thought about the lodge, the dock, the trails through the pines, the place where her father had tried to build a sanctuary and instead created a cage. I don't know yet, she said. But whatever we do, we should do it together. Rose looked at her, surprised. You'd want that? After everything? We're sisters, Lark said. He took that from us too. Maybe we can take it back. Rose's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. Okay. Together then, they spent the rest of the afternoon talking about the island, about their father, about the lives they'd built in the shadows of his choices. It wasn't healing, not yet. But it was honest, and that was a start. When Lark finally left, Rose walked her to the truck. Come back in a few weeks, Rose said. We'll go to the island together. See what's there. Decide what it should be. I will, Lark promised. As she drove east toward the mountains, the letter folded carefully in her pocket, Lark felt something shift inside her. The anger was still there and the hurt. But beneath it, growing like a seed in dark soil, was something else. The possibility of connection, of understanding, of a future that wasn't defined by absence. Her father had been a coward. But she and Rose, they didn't have to be. 3 weeks later, Lark returned to Seattle to pick up Rose. They'd spoken on the phone several times since Lark's first visit, tentative conversations that felt like two people learning a new language. Rose had read more of the letters, though not all of them. She'd told Lark about her life, 25 years as a high school teacher, a brief marriage that ended amicably, no children, a quiet life, carefully built, designed to be the opposite of the chaos and secrecy of her childhood. Lark had returned to her cabin in the meantime, but found it harder than expected to settle back into solitude. The silence that had once felt peaceful now felt empty. She kept thinking about Rose, about the island, about all the years they'd both spent alone because their father hadn't known how to be honest. When she pulled up to Rose's house, Rose was already waiting on the porch, a backpack at her feet. She looked nervous, her hands fidgeting with the straps of the pack. "Ready?" Lark asked as Rose climbed into the truck. "Not even a little bit," Rose admitted. "But I'm here." They drove north through rain that turned to mist as they climbed into the mountains. The conversation came easier this time. Talk about books they'd read, places they'd lived, the strange parallel paths their lives had taken. Both of them had chosen isolation, though in different forms. Both of them had spent decades avoiding the past. "I looked up the property records," Rose said as they neared Whitefish. "The island's been paid off since 1982. He set up an automatic payment system for the taxes. It's cost us, about $800 a year for the last 40 years. All to keep a place he never visited. Penance," Lark said. "Maybe, or just more avoidance." He couldn't face it, but he couldn't let it go either. When they reached the lake, Thomas was sitting in his usual spot, whittling another piece of cedar. He looked up as they approached, his eyes moving from Lark to Rose and back again. "Two of you now," he said. "It wasn't a question. This is Rose," Lark said. "My sister." Thomas nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something he'd already suspected. "Your father talked about her." "Not by name, but he'd sit right here sometimes, look out at the island and say, 'I had a daughter there once.' Past tense, like she died. I never asked questions. Figured it wasn't my business." Rose's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. They loaded their gear into the canoe, supplies for several days, tools for basic repairs, camping equipment. The paddle across felt different with Rose in the stern. Her strokes uncertain at first, but gradually finding rhythm with Lark's. Neither of them spoke. The silence filled only by the dip of paddles and the cry of gulls overhead. As the island drew closer, Rose set down her paddle and stared at the shore. "I remember this," she said quietly. "The dock. The way the trees come right down to the water. I used to stand here and throw rocks, trying to hit that big boulder." She pointed to a grey stone jutting from the shallows. "I thought if I could hit it 10 times in a row, my mother would get better." Lark said nothing, just guided the canoe toward the listing dock. They tied up and climbed onto the weathered planks. Rose stood there for a long moment, her eyes closed, breathing in the scent of pine and water. When she opened them, there were tears on her cheeks. "I was 17 the last time I was here," she said. "I swore I'd never come back. And now," she shook her head, "I don't know what I expected to feel. Anger maybe, or grief. But mostly I just feel old." "Come on," Lark said gently. "Let's go see the lodge." They walked the trail together, Rose's steps slowing as they approached the clearing. When the lodge came into view, she stopped entirely. "It's smaller than I remembered," she said, "and more broken." "Most things are when you come back to them," Lark said. Inside, Rose moved through the rooms like a ghost, revisiting her own haunting. She stood in front of the fireplace, staring at the photographs still hanging above it. She ran her hand along the kitchen counter where her mother had once prepared meals. She stood in the doorway of her old bedroom and looked at the drawings still pinned to the wall. "I made those when I was 6, she said. I thought if I drew us happy enough times, it would become true. Lark watched her sister navigate the wreckage of her childhood, saw the way grief and memory moved across her face. She wanted to say something comforting, something wise, but all the words felt inadequate. Rose moved to the attic ladder and looked up. "Is this where you found the journals?" "Yes." "I want to see." They climbed up together, Rose moving slowly as though each step required a decision. The attic was just as Lark had left it. Boxes stacked against the walls, dust thick in the air. Rose opened the first box and pulled out one of the photo albums. She turned the pages in silence, studying images of herself as a child, of her mother, of a version of their father neither of them had truly known. When she reached the portrait of Violet, she stopped. "She was beautiful," Rose said. "I forget that sometimes. I was so young when she got sick that most of my memories are of her in pain, wasting away. But she was beautiful." Lark stood beside her, looking at the photograph. "She looks kind," she was. "She used to sing to me at night, these old folk songs her mother had taught her. Even when she was sick, even when it hurt to breathe, she'd sing." Rose closed the album carefully. He took that from her, the chance to be more than a secret. They sat in the attic for a long time, going through the boxes, reading passages from the journals aloud. The afternoon light faded, and shadows gathered in the corners. Finally, Rose stood and brushed the dust from her jeans. "There's something I need to show you," Lark said. "In the clearing at the center of the island. I found it a few weeks ago, but I wanted you to be here when I went back." "What is it?" "A cairn, and something he left for us. Both of us." They descended the ladder and made their way through the lodge, gathering flashlights and water. Outside, the light was beginning to fail, the sky turning from blue to violet. Lark led Rose along a trail marked by old stone cairns, following the route she'd memorized from the map carved into the attic beams. The trail climbed steadily, winding through dense stands of pine and across small clearings carpeted with moss. Rose followed without speaking. Her breathing labored from the altitude and the emotion. After 30 minutes, they emerged into a clearing at the island's highest point. The view was breathtaking, the lake stretching in all directions, the mountains rising beyond, the sky vast and open above them. In the center of the clearing stood the cairn, a careful stack of stones rising 4 feet high. "He built this," Lark said, "sometime after he stopped coming to the island. I think it was the only way he knew how to say goodbye." Rose approached the cairn slowly, running her hand over the stones. "There's something underneath, isn't there?" Lark nodded. Together, they carefully dismantled the top portion of the cairn, revealing a weatherproof box wedged between the larger base stones. Lark pulled it free and set it on the ground. Inside were 2 letters sealed in plastic, one addressed to Rose and one to Lark. There was also a small wooden box containing military medals, bronze star, purple heart, campaign ribbons, and a locket on a delicate chain. Rose opened the locket. Inside were 2 photographs, each no larger than a postage stamp. One showed Rose as a toddler. The other showed Lark at about the same age. "He carried us with him," Rose said, her voice breaking. "Both of us." Lark handed Rose her letter. "Do you want to read them now?" Rose nodded. They sat on the ground, their backs against the cairn, and opened their letters. Lark read hers first. "Dear Lark, if you're reading this, you've found the island, found Rose, and found the truth. I'm sorry you had to piece it together from the wreckage I left behind. You deserved better. I was never a good father to you. I know that. I was cold, distant, unable to show you the love you deserved. Every time I looked at you, I saw what I'd stolen from Rose, legitimacy, recognition, a father who wasn't ashamed. My guilt made me a ghost in my own life. But you are not my failure, Lark. You are strong and capable and whole in ways I never was. You built a life on your own terms, found peace in solitude, learned to be sufficient unto yourself. I admire that, even if I never told you so. The island is yours now. Yours and Rose's. I hope it can be something other than a monument to my mistakes. I hope you two can make it into something that matters, a place of connection instead of hiding. You have a sister now, if she'll have you. Take care of each other. Be the family I couldn't give you. I'm proud of you, Lark. I should have said it when I was alive, but I'm saying it now. I'm proud of who you are, despite everything I failed to give you. Love, Dad." Lark folded the letter and looked at Rose, who was crying openly, her own letter trembling in her hands. "What does yours say?" Lark asked. "That he's sorry, that he loved my mother, that he wishes he'd been brave enough to claim me, that he hopes I can forgive him, but he understands if I can't." Rose wiped her eyes. "And that I have a sister now, and maybe that's enough to make something new from what he destroyed." They sat together as the last light faded from the sky. Two sisters who'd been strangers a month ago, bound now by blood and loss, and the tentative hope that they could build something better than what they'd been given. "What do we do now?" Rose asked. Lark looked at the cairn, at the lake beyond, at the sister sitting beside her. "We decide what this place becomes, together." They spent that night in the clearing, building a small fire and watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. Neither of them wanted to return to the lodge yet, to sleep in rooms that carried too many memories. Instead, they unrolled their sleeping bags near the cairn and lay side by side, talking in the darkness. Rose told stories Lark had never heard, about her mother's laugh, about learning to fish from the dock, about the way her father would arrive on the island, looking exhausted, and leave looking worse, about the silence that had defined her childhood, the constant awareness that something was wrong, but not understanding what. Lark shared her own memories, the funeral where her father stood like a statue, the years of living in the mountains, the relief she'd felt in solitude, and the loneliness that had grown alongside it, the way she'd convinced herself she didn't need family, didn't need connection, because needing meant risking the kind of abandonment she'd already experienced. "We're more alike than I expected," Rose said. "We both learned to run," Lark agreed. "But we came back. That's something." In the morning, they descended to the lodge and began the work of deciding its fate. They walked through every room, taking inventory of what could be saved and what was beyond repair. The roof needed replacing. The porch was dangerous. Most of the furniture was ruined. But the structure itself, the heavy log walls, the stone fireplace, was still solid. "We could restore it," Rose said, standing in the main room. "Turn it into something new. A retreat, maybe. A place people could come to, people who need space to heal, to think, to be alone without being lonely. Or we could tear it down," Lark countered. "Start fresh. Build something that isn't haunted by what came before." Rose considered this, then shook her head. "I used to want that, to erase this place from existence. But now I don't know. Maybe it deserves a second chance. Maybe we all do." They spent the day working, clearing debris, boarding up broken windows, making lists of what they'd need. It was physical work, exhausting, but it gave them something to focus on, besides the weight of everything they'd learned. By evening, they'd cleared the main room and the kitchen, making them habitable enough to sleep in. As they sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the lake, Rose pulled the unopened letters from her backpack, the ones their father had sent over the years, the ones she'd never read. "I think I'm ready," she said. "You don't have to," Lark said. "I know, but I want to. And I want you here when I do." Rose opened the first letter, dated September 1988, a year after she'd left. She read it silently, her expression shifting from anger to sadness to something softer. Then she opened another and another, reading passages aloud when the words struck her. He writes about seeing a girl who looked like me in a grocery store, and how it made him cry in the parking lot. He describes visiting your mother's grave, talking to her, telling her he's sorry. He sends me updates about the island, how the trees are growing, how the dock finally collapsed, how he can't bring himself to come back anymore. The letters span decades, a one-sided conversation with a daughter who wouldn't respond. Some were short, just a few lines. Others went on for pages, detailed accounts of his daily life, his regrets, his persistent, stubborn hope that someday she might forgive him. The last letter was dated 6 months before he died. Rose's hands shook as she opened it. "Dear Rosie, I'm getting old. My body's failing in ways I can't ignore anymore. The doctors say I have maybe a year, maybe less. I'm writing this because I need you to know something. You were right to leave. You were right to be angry. You were right about everything. I spent my life trying to protect people by hiding them, but all I did was make everyone invisible, including myself. I thought I was being careful, but I was just being a coward. I'm leaving the island to Lark. I hope she finds you. I hope you two can be the family I never let you be. You both deserved a father who was whole, who could love you without shame or distance. I couldn't be that, but maybe you can be sisters to each other. I'm not asking for forgiveness anymore. I just want you to know that loving you and your mother was the best thing I ever did, and hiding you was the worst. I'm sorry it took me 50 years to understand the difference. If I could go back, I'd marry your mother properly. I'd stand beside her in public. I'd introduce you to the world as my daughter. I'd choose courage over comfort. But I can't go back, and I'm out of time to go forward. Be happy, Rosie, that's all I want now. Be happy, and know that you were loved, even if I was too broken to show it properly. Dad, Rose set the letter down, tears streaming down her face. Lark put her arm around her sister's shoulders, and they sat together on the porch as darkness fell over the island. He knew, Rose whispered. He understood what he'd done. That doesn't make it right, but it matters, Lark finished. Rose nodded. It matters. They sat in silence for a long time, the weight of their father's words settling between them. Finally, Rose spoke again. I forgive him, she said. Not because he earned it, but because I'm tired of carrying the anger. It's too heavy, and I don't want it anymore. Lark thought about her own anger, the 30 years of distance she'd maintained, the life she'd built in solitude. I forgive him too, she said. And maybe I forgive myself for staying away so long. Rose looked at her sister, really looked at her, and for the first time since they'd met, she smiled. We're going to be okay, aren't we? Yeah, Lark said. I think we are. The next morning brought clear skies and a decision. They would restore the lodge, not as it had been, but as something new. A place that acknowledged the past without being trapped by it. They spent hours sketching plans on paper torn from Rose's journal, discussing what the island could become. We could make it a writer's retreat, Rose suggested. A place for people who need silence and space. Or a family camp, Lark offered. Somewhere people can reconnect without the noise of the world. Or just a place for us, Rose said quietly. A place where we can be sisters without all the history crushing us. They settled on that, at least to start. The island would be theirs, a shared inheritance they would shape together. Everything else could be decided later, when the wounds were less raw and the future felt less uncertain. Over the following days, they worked side by side, cleaning and repairing what they could. Rose proved surprisingly capable with tools, having learned basic carpentry from the husband she'd been briefly married to. Lark brought her years of cabin maintenance to the task, her hands steady and sure. They replaced broken window panes with plywood they found in the shed. They swept out decades of debris. They patched the roof with a tarp and secured it against the wind. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. In the evenings, they cooked simple meals on a camp stove and talked. Rose told Lark about her students, the ones who changed her life as much as she'd changed theirs. Lark told Rose about the rhythms of mountain living, the satisfaction of growing her own food, the peace of watching seasons change from her cabin porch. Would you ever leave your mountain? Rose asked one night. Lark considered the question. A month ago, the answer would have been an immediate no, but now, sitting beside her sister under a sky full of stars, she wasn't sure. I don't know, she admitted. I built that life because I needed to, but maybe I don't need it the same way anymore. You could still have it, Rose said. The solitude, the simplicity, but maybe with, I don't know, with connection too. You don't have to choose one or the other. Is that what you want? Lark asked. Connection. Rose looked out at the dark water. I've been alone a long time. By choice, mostly. I convinced myself I was fine with it, but these past few weeks, working here with you, I realized I wasn't fine. I was just resigned. She turned to Lark. I'd like to have a sister. If you're willing. I'm willing, Lark said. more than willing. On their last day before returning to their separate lives, they hiked to the cairn one final time. They decided to rebuild it properly, to make it a permanent marker of what the island represented. They carried stones from the shore, carefully selecting each one, and stacked them in a spiral pattern that would withstand wind and weather. When the cairn was complete, taller and more stable than before, Rose pulled something from her pocket. It was the photograph of their father with Violet, the one Lark had found in the lodge. Rose placed it at the base of the cairn, tucked beneath the largest stone. "So he's not forgotten," she said. "And neither is my mother." Lark added the dog. Tags she'd carried for so long, the ones that had been her last connection to a father she'd never understood. She laid them beside the photograph. "And so we can finally let go," she said. They stood together in the clearing, the wind moving through the pines, the lake spreading endlessly below them. It felt like a ceremony, though they'd spoken no formal words. A letting go and a taking up all at once. "I'll come back in the spring," Rose said. "We can start the real work then, the roof, the porch, making it livable." "I'll be here," Lark promised. "And maybe sometimes I could visit your cabin, see where you live." Lark smiled. "I'd like that." They descended the trail one last time, their steps sure and unhurried. At the lodge they packed their few belongings and made a final walk through the rooms. Everything looked different now. Not haunted, but potential. A place that could be remade, reshaped, given new purpose. Before they left, Rose paused in front of the fireplace where the photographs still hung. She took down the picture of herself as a child, the one with her mother. She looked at it for a long moment, then carefully placed it in her pack. "So I don't forget where I came from," she said. Lark took down the photo of their father in his uniform and did the same. "So we remember what we survived." They paddled back to shore together, their rhythm synchronized now, two people moving as one. Thomas was waiting when they arrived, his weathered face creasing into something like approval. "You'll be back," he said. It wasn't a question. "We will," Rose confirmed. "Good. Your father would have liked that, knowing you two found each other." They loaded the truck and began the drive south toward Seattle, toward their separate lives that were now, finally, connected. Rose fell asleep, somewhere near the Idaho border, her head against the window. Lark drove through the darkness, feeling lighter than she had in 30 years. She had a sister now. She had a place that was hers, theirs, to shape. She had against all odds the beginning of something that looked like family. And for the first time in her life, that felt like enough. 6 months later, the island looked different. The lodge had a new roof, cedar shakes that gleamed reddish-brown in the spring sunlight. The porch had been rebuilt, the railing sturdy and level, with 2 chairs positioned to face the lake. The windows were whole, the glass clean enough to reflect the surrounding pines. Inside, the rooms had been cleared and scrubbed, the worst of the decay removed, leaving something that felt less like a tomb and more like a home. Lark and Rose had made 4 trips together over those months, working through fall and into the early winter, then pausing when the snow came and resuming as soon as the ice on the lake broke. They'd hired a contractor from Whitefish for the big structural work, the roof, the foundation repair, the new plumbing, but they'd done most of the finish work themselves. Painting walls, refinishing floors, building new furniture from salvaged wood. The lodge would never be grand, but it was sound. It was theirs. They decided to keep it as a retreat, but only for themselves, at least for now. A place where they could escape when the world felt too loud, where they could remember what they'd survived and what they'd built in its place. Rose had started coming every few weeks, sometimes staying a full weekend, sometimes just overnight. She'd bring books and papers to grade, spreading them across the kitchen table, working in companionable silence while Lark cooked or tended the small garden they'd planted near the lodge. Lark had loosened her grip on the mountain cabin. She still spent most of her time there. Old habits died hard, but she'd started thinking of it differently. Not as a fortress against the world, but as one place among several. A home, but not a prison. She'd visited Rose in Seattle twice, awkward trips at first, learning to navigate a city after decades of avoiding them. But Rose had been patient, taking her to quiet cafes and bookshops, places where the noise was manageable. They'd walked along the waterfront, had dinner at Rose's house, spent evenings talking about books and plans and the future. It wasn't always easy. They'd had arguments about how to restore the lodge, about whether to tell extended family about their relationship, about the best way to honor their father's memory. Rose wanted to be more public, to acknowledge what had been hidden. Lark wanted to keep it private, to protect what felt still fragile. They'd compromised, eventually agreeing to take things slowly, to let the relationship develop without pressure or performance. On a clear morning in late May, they returned to the island together, this time bringing something new. They'd commissioned a small bronze plaque, simple and understated, and they planned to mount it beside the lodge's front door. Rose held it up to the light, reading the inscription aloud, "The Mendenhall Sisters' Lodge. In memory of those we've lost, in hope of what we've found. It's perfect," Lark said. They mounted the plaque carefully, Rose holding it level while Lark drove in the screws. When it was secure, they stepped back and looked at it together. "We really did this," Rose said. "We took his secret and turned it into something good." "We did," Lark agreed. They spent the day working on the last of the small projects, hanging curtains, organizing the kitchen, placing books on the shelves they'd built. In the late afternoon, they walked to the cairn at the island's center, following the trail that was now well worn from their repeated visits. The cairn stood solid and strong, weathered by a winter of snow and wind, but still intact. The photograph and the dog tags were still there, protected beneath the stones. Rose had added something on her last visit, a pressed flower from her mother's garden, one she'd kept in a book for 30 years. They stood together in the clearing, the same view spreading before them, the lake, the mountains, the endless sky. "I've been thinking about something," Rose said, "about forgiveness and what it means. I used to think forgiving him meant saying what he did was okay. But it's not okay. It never will be." "No," Lark agreed. "It won't. But I can forgive him and still acknowledge the harm. I can let go of the anger without pretending he was a good father. He wasn't, but he was our father, and we survived him, and that matters." Lark nodded slowly. "I think about him sometimes, about the life he could have lived if he'd been braver. If he'd claimed you and your mother, if he'd been honest with my mother, if he'd just chosen truth over comfort. How different everything would have been. But then we wouldn't be here," Rose said. "You and me together building this. Maybe that's the only good thing that came from his mistakes, that we found each other in the wreckage." "Maybe," Lark said. "Or maybe we would have found each other anyway, in some better version of this story." They walked back to the lodge as the sun began to set, the light turning everything gold. Inside, they built a fire in the newly repaired fireplace and sat together on the couch they'd brought from Rose's house, wrapped in quilts watching the flames. "I'm glad you're my sister," Rose said quietly. "I'm glad you're mine," Lark replied. They sat in comfortable silence, the fire crackling, the island settling into evening around them. Outside, the water lapped gently against the shore. An owl called from somewhere in the trees. The lodge, once a monument to secrecy and shame, held them both in its warmth. Lark thought about the question Rose had asked months ago, whether she'd ever leave her mountain. She still didn't have a clear answer, but she knew now that leaving didn't mean abandoning, that she could have solitude and connection both, that family didn't have to mean suffocation. Some wounds never fully heal, she thought. They just stop bleeding. You learn to live with the scars, to tell the story of how you got them without letting it define everything that comes after. Her father had carried his wounds in silence, letting them fester until they poisoned everything he touched. But she and Rose, they'd opened theirs to the light, cleaned them out, and let them begin to close properly. It wouldn't erase what had been lost, but it might, just might, be enough to build something new. Rose shifted beside her, her head dropping onto Lark's shoulder. "Stay tomorrow too?" she asked sleepily. "Yeah," Lark said. "I'll stay." And in that moment, on an island that had been built on secrets, two sisters sat together in a silence that was no longer empty. The past was behind them, heavy but carried together now. The future stretched ahead, uncertain but no longer lonely. Outside, the lake reflected the stars, and the forest breathed its ancient rhythm, and the world spun on as it always had. But here, in this place that had been redeemed from darkness, there was peace, and that, Lark thought, was more than enough.